Our goal tonight is twofold. Firstly, to try to create a vision of a community that could exist in a theoretical world based on three pillars. As Chazal say, Al Shlosha Dvarim Ha'olam Omed. The world stands on three pillars. On the pillar of Torah, of Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. I'm going to take the phrase Gemilut Chasadim in a loose translation. And it encompasses not just actual chesed, but the entire gamut of sensitivity towards the needs of another person, of another Jew, what we call mitzvos bein adam lechaveru. And if we take these three pillars together and we form a community around them, then perhaps ha'olam omed. Olam here means not just the world in a physical sense, not just the universe, but a Jewish community. And Chazal understood that a Jewish community is a microcosm of the entire world. So we have now a triangle with three parts to it, or a table, if you will, with three legs: Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. Together they form a unit. In the Torah, the hashkafa, the teachings of three giants, that is Rabbi Yisrael SALANTER, founder of the Musser movement, and Rabbi STERNHARZ from Breslov, who gives us insights into so many areas of Torah and Pnimius HaTorah. And finally, my own Rebbe, Rav SOLOVEITCHIK. We have here three individuals that I believe have a tremendous common ground. And in my mind, it's a bit of a chidush to say that they all believe in one common ground. And I try to work very hard to identify, pinpoint what that common ground is. And I came up with a concept called Knesset Yisrael. These three giants were all facing the same problem. And we used the phrase in the past, checklist Judaism. They wanted to create a more profound Knesset Yisrael. That term refers to the entire Jewish community as one entity, each individual with his own unique talents and making his own or her own contribution, unique contribution, but together forming one entity. And my Rebbe used to speak about the 12 stones that formed one large stone under the head of Yaakov Avinu. That was Knesset Yisrael. Yaakov Avinu was very afraid during many years and decades of his life when he thought that Yosef was gone. And that would mean that one piece of Knesset Yisrael was taken away, and Yaakov had not fulfilled his goal, his mission in life, to create an entity, Knesset Yisrael, that had to be made up of 12 different tribes, forming one entity. I have here the words of Rab Nosson. He writes that Heim Omrim, you can come up and take the papers. Heim Omrim Matem Isparim. They look at the Jewish people. These are members of the other nations, and they say, "What are you so glorious about? What makes you so glorious? Halo Anam Merubim Yosem Michem. Our numbers are so much greater than yours. Ki atem ha'ma'at mikol ha'amim. You, the Jewish people, are the smallest of all the nations." And what is our response? It is al yedei achdus, through unity, shebi Yisrael, bebchinas mi ki amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. We are goy echad. We are one indivisible entity, one nation. And therefore, lo yeheba negev bifkodosam. Even if we have to count the people, we count them through the Max HaShekel, there won't be any destruction because we are one. And Rabbi Nosson goes on to say that when the individual comes in front of the judgment, the Kisei HaKavod, and he's failing, he has what we call blemishes and pagam, then we quote the pasuk, V'amech kulam tzadikim. What is the word kulam tzadikim? It doesn't mean that we were all tzadikim. It means that as a kulam, as an entity, each and every one of us, insofar as we're part of this entity, we are tzaddikim, and therefore will be judged favorably. And this emphasis on being sensitive and careful about the individual and his or her sensitivities lies at the very heart, the very essence of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's musser movement. What Rabbi Yisrael tried to teach us is that we shouldn't make mistakes. There are common errors in our religious life in which we put all the emphasis on ritual law. And he points out in one of his writings that as far as netilas yadayim is concerned, washing our hands before we eat a meal, no one is lacking on that. Everyone's all together. As far as eating kashrus, again, back in the day, today things are a little different, but we're all maktu, we're all very careful not to eat treifa food. But yet, when it comes to business ethics, we seem to be failing. Remember the story about an individual who's a shochet, and he felt a heavy responsibility on his shoulders that maybe he's not slaughtering the animal properly and people are eating treifas. And therefore, he comes to Rabbi Yisrael and he says, I want to change my occupation. I'm giving up my role as a shochet. So Rabbi Yisrael asks him, so what are you going to do with your life? And he says, I'm going to go into business. Said Rabbi Yisrael, you should know that the laws that govern business ethics, the halachas, the lotases, and the essays, are that much more severe than even feeding someone non-kosher food. So this kind of pick and choose in which we think that these laws are more important than these and those mitzvahs more than other, that's what Rabbi Yisrael was fighting against. All mitzvahs are equally significant. And we should be putting extra emphasis on developing our midos. In one of the pages that you have that says on top of it, Or Yisrael, there's a footnote that's absolutely fascinating. And I want to share it with you. I'm hoping you'll find such a page. Is there? Or Yisrael, yeah. So you'll note underneath the line on the bottom is a footnote from Rabbi Yisrael. And he talks about himself, Yotzakti Mayim, Nimori Harav, Rabbi Yosef Zundel. Rabbi Yosef Zundel was the Rebbe of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And Rabbi Yisrael says about himself, Ad kan lo higati lekarsua. He says, I haven't even gotten to his knees. I'm not even on the same level. You can't even put me in the same category as my Rebbe. And now he describes his Rebbe in a few lines in a very fascinating way. Hu sulam mutzav arza. He's like a ladder, like remember Jacob's ladder in his dream, that is situated, grounded on the earth, on the arza. What does that mean? In the Nimshal, it means Tarud Birayone Amischar. His Rebbe was a businessman. His feet were on the ground. He was constantly preoccupied with thoughts about how to make his business successful. Levakesh Tarfo, so that he could bring some funds and sustain his family. Kederech Balabayis, Asher Michyasam Kaved Lifneim. He classifies his Rebbe, listen to this, as a balabas. But Verosho Magia Shamaima. But where's the head of the ladder? It's all the way up in heaven. Bitirda Gedola Midai L'chai Nafsho. If you think that he's carrying a heavy burden of tirda with regard to mischar, his work, his preoccupation, that's nothing compared to the heavy burden that he carries himself on his shoulders for chaye nafsho, for the life of his soul. And he talks a little bit about the study program of his Rebbe. Imagine, his Rebbe is heavily involved in business in order to eke out a living. But Lomed, Gemara, V'chule, chule means etc. It means Gemara, Poskim, Beis Yosef, Kol Hachronim Be'iyun. Look at that word Be'iyun. Each one of these sources he studies in depth. And especially the Bir Hagra. He puts extra effort to try to unravel the mysteries of the Bir Hagra, a commentary of the Vilna Gaon on Shulchan Aruch. Ukshalomed Seif Shulchan Aruch, or Inyanim Kol Avizrayu, when he studies one paragraph, one law in the Shulchan Aruch with all its commentaries, Hayatzir Lefanav, he has the entire picture clearly in front of his eyes. As if somebody is coming to ask him a question, halacha l'maisa, and he is going to look at this picture that's in the apple of his mind in order to answer the question. V'iyun v'ayin v'chaker heitev, and he goes into great depth until he finally can determine the psak halacha, the final decision. V'az, and then chozil l'famim rabos, he goes over it until he has it in his back pocket. And then he learns Tanakh. Interesting. Kol limuda b'Tanakh, u'b'Gemara, u'b'Midrashim, v'Zohar, yisod l'chapes yidiyas ha'maisa, al kol ela hayigia. Imagine an individual who is on such a level of Torah knowledge that he integrates all of Tanakh, all of Shas, all of Poskim, and Be'iyun Gadol, so that he sees the whole picture, and he has it in his back pocket, and he's working on giving answers and handing down decisions on any question that might come up, and he's constantly reviewing it. And this is a man whose the feet of his ladder are situated deep on the earth because he's involved in mischar, kaved miod. This, I believe, is Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's vision of a Jewish community. A Jewish community that's made up of balabatim. Again, that's the term he uses to describe his Rebbe. A balabatim who are working with occupations, bringing home a living, a livelihood, and yet look how steep they are in the study of Torah, and always trying to discover their own midos, how they can be more sensitive, how they can be more careful and meticulous about the laws of business, of Choshen Mishpat, an area of halacha, a wing of the Shulchan Aruch that is highly ignored. And I ask a historical question here tonight. Was Rabbi Yisrael successful? Did he actually live up to his ideal and create such a community? And here, when we want to evaluate the legacy of Rabbi Yisrael, we have to really subdivide it into two categories. As far as Balabatim is concerned, in his time period, they were so involved in trying to eke out a living, they didn't have the mind to focus on all these other areas of Limud Torah, of Tikkun Amidos. However, he sent two of his great Talmidim, the Altar of Slobodka and Rav Isla Blazer, and we'll talk in a minute about the Altar of Kelm. That was a special category. But these were the students of Rabbi Yisrael who were successful in bringing the musser movement into the yeshiva world. And to this day, that tradition of setting aside time in the daily discipline, the daily schedule of Torah study for musser and the Sfarim of musser, the Limud musser, is still very much in vogue in the yeshiva world. That's where Rabbi Yisrael had his greatest success. And if I ask the question, what happened in one particular Lithuanian town called Kelm? One of Rabbi Yisrael's great students the Altar of Kelm came into this city and he addressed the Balabatim. It wasn't his job to try to make inroads into the yeshiva world. He was trying to create a community of Balabatim who would be living the life of musser. And he was successful to a great extent. The people in Kelm were known to live on a higher level in terms of their sensitivities, their bein adam lechavero, their chesed. I'll give you one small example. You may laugh at this and consider it insignificant, but in its time, it was greatly significant. In Kelm, in the marketplace, people got very excited, and sometimes they would curse each other. This is what went on. I think it's probably true even today. But in Kelm, there was no such thing. There was never an altercation which led up to a curse, to a klala. This is one example of the impact of the Altar of Kelm on the city of Kelm. And here we're talking about the impact on Balabatim, on people who are dedicated to work, to occupation, and to eke out a living. There's a famous story about a certain town in Lita. I don't know if you've heard about a period in Jewish history called the Canvanister. What it was, the Russian government was conscripting young Jewish men to the Russian army. And it could mean 25 years in the army. No Yiddishkeit, no shuls, no kosher food, no nothing. It was horrible. And the word got back to Rabbi Yisrael that in a certain town, the rich people in that town did not have any of their sons in the army. What happened? They would bribe with their wealth the officials, and what they were able to do was they were able to take the son of a poor family and substitute him for their sons. Do you follow? So you have rich people, each one had a name, and Rabbi Berzon knew all of them by name, and they would, mafioso style, I would use the term, they would grab young men who are wealth from poor families and send them to replace their sons because they ransomed their sons by paying bribery with their wealth. And Rabbi Yisrael said, I'm coming for Shabbos to this town. Rabbi Yisrael came to this town for Shabbos. They made a gala kiddush in his honor. And at the kiddush, he calls up one by one each one of the wealthy people. And he says, I know what your machmir on. I know what your strictness is. This one was very strict about the laws of ribbis. This one was strict about shmura matzah. One was strict about Erevin. He wouldn't carry in the town because he didn't trust the Erev. Each one had his own chumrah. And he bombasted them. He said, oh, you want to have your own stricture, your own chumrah. But what about the Isur Doraisa, the Torah prohibition of gonev ishu mecharo, when you're stealing someone? And by the end of Shabbos, each one of these wealthy balabatim, oh, this is, how you doing? Each one of these wealthy balabatim would give up on that position that he had procured with money, with wealth, and everything was straightened out. I mean, this was the impact of Rabbi Yisrael because he knew each one's chumras. And he could say, oh yeah, you're machmer in this, that's your stricture. What Rabbi Yisrael tried to create was a society of ehrlich Yidden, honest people, people who were straight, people who took the laws of the monetary realm very seriously. But what he found was that he was fighting an uphill battle. So what is musser today in our contemporary society? And I have to tell you this. To study Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's work, we'll call him his magnum opus, this Ar Yisrael, one page of which you have, is very difficult, almost impossible. The language is very heavy, very terse. It comes from a different society. So where is the modern world of musser? Where is musser in contemporary life? So there are many examples I could give. There's a book called Climbing Jacob's Ladder. There's a book by Rabbi Solomon, the Mashgiach of Lakewood. But I would like to focus your attention, and I photocopied one page for you, from a book called Ale Shar, Rav Shlomo Volpa, who passed away not long ago. He instituted in the city of Yerushalayim, in our time, that which Rabbi Yisrael was striving for. And that's called the Beis HaMusser. He had a house that was dedicated to the study of musser. But it wasn't the musser of the old time. And as you'll see in this page, which is called Hevdel Adorot, he speaks about the different generations. And he points out that the musser at the time of Rabbi Yisrael, in the musser movement initially, would not cut the mustard in our contemporary life. The musser was heavy tochacha. And today our young people cannot tolerate this heavy kind of tochacha. We have to focus on the greatness of man. We have to emphasize the mila, the superior nature of man, the qualities that he could strive for, the glorious, lofty character traits. And if we instill in our students and in our sons and daughters this love for those ideals, then they will live up to that level. And they'll be inspired. In one of the pages that I gave you, there's a short paragraph from the Altar of Kelm. It's called Chesed Shel Torah. I don't want to spend the time looking for it, but it's amongst these pages. And what the Altar of Kelm points out is that our concept of chesed in the world of musser, of Jewish ethics, is radically different, fundamentally different than the concept of ethics in the secular world. In the secular world, someone who spends a lot of money to help the poor, he's considered on the highest level. We bow down to him. He's the Ish Chesed. He's the great manifestation of chesed and goodness. No. Chesed, from a Torah perspective, says the Altar, means appreciating the greatness of man, realizing and acknowledging that man is Vatachasreu ma'at melokim, as David HaMelech puts it in Tehillim. We are a little bit lower than the Almighty. What does that mean? Man is created with Tzelem Elokim. He's, so to speak, a chelek Elokam imal. He is part of the divinity. No matter what you do for him, it's never going to be enough. And he quotes the psikta, which I mentioned a few weeks ago, Hayim lachta es chavercha alecha. So the first leg of the community that we're talking about in our vision is the leg of Gemilut Chasadim, focused on sensitivity. I'll give you one example. Hachnosas archim. I don't know if you've ever had an experience where you ended up somewhere and you needed a host. You needed someone to take you in, and there was no one there. It's a horrible experience of loneliness, of feeling ignored, of feeling alone in this world. But Achnosas Orchim means, as we saw from Avram Avinu, to go out actively and seek out guests. Look and see who needs a place. And not only that, but Avram Avinu does everything. He stands head and foot over the guests, because no matter what you do on behalf of these Tzelem Elokim, it's never going to be enough. The sky's the limit and beyond. When Adam HaRishon was first created, the Medrash tells us the Malachi Ashares felt that he was a godly being, and they wanted to bring sacrifices to him. That's how great man is. Man is an angel that fell from Shemayim. The sensitivity that we need. Of course, bad midos, like kas, getting angry, jealousy, there's no room for that. But we have to work on that. And what Rav Volpa points out in his article here about our doros, our contemporary generations, is that at the very least, we have to make our students aware of these great milos, of these great character traits of honesty and being straight and being sensitive and caring for the next one. How can I help the next one? And even if we don't rebuke our people, we don't criticize them and put them down. On the contrary, we build them up. But nevertheless, by exposing them and having them study on a regular basis these great, lofty character traits, they'll have something to strive for. And this is what I believe is contemporary musser. This is the community that Rabbi Yisrael would have us create in our time. So again, just to repeat, our opening line tonight is that we're trying to create a triangle made of 3 elements. One element we spoke about is Gemilut Chasadim. Now let's go on to another element, and that is Torah. Torah, I believe, is the great contribution, again, of all of Gedolei Yisrael, but I'm going to focus on my Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik. The emphasis on Havanas HaTorah, on delving deep into the Torah, not to learn the Torah superficially, to constantly ask questions and analyze, to classify and define concepts as precise as you possibly can. And we saw in our Rebbe an unbelievable hasmada. What I mean by hasmada is a dedication. When he went home at the end of the class, it wasn't like closing the book and I'll be back tomorrow for the next lesson. It was, let's study it over and over again, in depth, with a critical eye. And in the ethics of Rav Soloveitchik, we translate metaphysical ideas into reality, into practical considerations and demands. For example, God created the universe. Yesh me'ayin. We have to imitate God. We also have to be creative. And we have to use all of our energies to be creative. And especially in Torah learning. But that element of creativity goes beyond. We mentioned once in the past, maybe you recall, that according to Rabbi Avodah, the Medrash, God created many worlds. He was not satisfied with these worlds. We have to imitate God. And we have to realize that sometimes we put in all this effort and we build something and we create something, but yet it falls apart. It collapses in front of our eyes. Rabbi Akiva lost 24,000 students, but yet he got up, cleaned the dust off of his cloak, so to speak, and began all over again from scratch. 5 new students. So something went wrong and something failed, but I go back and I recreate endlessly with dedication. The concept of creation is metaphysical. We can't understand yesh me'ayin ex nihilo, but what we learn from this is that God is the owner of the universe. God possesses all. This is the great foundation of ethics. Everything I have in life, all of my talents, all of my abilities, all of my energies, they belong to Him with a capital H. He created the world and He owns the world. It all belongs to Him. And now I'd like to move on to the third leg on which our olam is standing. And that is Avodah. And here we get to Rab Nosson, the great Rab Nosson, who today was his yahrzeit on Asar B'Teves. He built for us a world of Avodah. Talk about the subjects and the themes. It's just almost endless. His magnum opus is called Likutei Halachos, made up of 8 volumes. But beyond that, he wrote many, many other works. On tefillah, on prayer, he wrote an entire work, which is called Likutei Tfilos. Our son up in Carmiel has begun to recite some of those tefillos. Had nothing to do with me, on his own. And he says they're incredible, they're wonderful. These are Rab Nosson's tefillos that he authored, that he created. He built a world about not only tefillah, but simcha. The antithesis, the enemy of everything that we do is atzvus, is when we feel down. That brings us to a state of melancholy, of darkness. And what could defeat all these powers? It's got to be simcha, a realization that we are the creation of our Kadosh Baruch Hu. We are the Tzelem Elokim. to appreciate the incredible, endless good and benevolence that God bestowed upon us. And most important is his karvus Lashem, to build a community where the emphasis is on getting closer and closer to Hashem. One of the main concepts in Rabbi Nosson's writings, and it comes from his Rebbe, Rabbi Nachman, is Tikkun HaBris. What is Tikkun HaBris? Of course, we know there's a bris milah, but it goes way beyond the bris milah. We're talking about a bris. A bris, es brischa tishmoru, means a covenant between man and Almighty God. In the context of that covenant, man makes an absolute commitment that all of his focus is on getting closer and closer to Hashem, to fulfill God's will. Whenever we get sidetracked by passions and lusts and desires, whether it's in this area or that area, that is a pagam, that is a blemish in the bris, because the bris is an all-inclusive, is an all-inclusive commitment. And therefore, he builds an entire world around how we can battle against these forces that try to trip us down. His thesis is that whenever we try and succeed in getting a little bit higher and we ascend the ladder and come closer to God, at that point, we are automatically in a situation where we'll be tested with impediments and barriers and darkness and confusion. And all this is part of a divine plan for our benefit, so that we could climb even higher and higher up that ladder. So that when it comes to the realm of Avodah, of service of the Almighty, we have so much to learn from Rabbi Nosson. And that, I believe, is the third leg of our table that we spoke about before, the Gimel Yesodos Sha'olam Bonayim. I want to talk to you a little bit about what I think is unique in the contribution of Rav Soloveitchik in terms of creating a community. I will mention the following concepts. Number one, contemporary life. Number two, the state of Israel and Zionism. Number three, attitudes towards non-Jews. Number four, attitude towards secular studies. And number five, the place and the role of a woman. These are contemporary issues that Rav Soloveitchik, more than any of the other giants, addressed these issues. He was not embarrassed. He took on a host of contemporary issues, not the least of which is the attitude that we have towards the Zionist entity. And please note that in his upbringing, whether it is in his father's house or in his grandfather's house, the emphasis was not on Zionism. Zionism was not on the agenda at all. He came from what we call an Aguda background. What happened? Rav Soloveitchik gave a lecture in which he describes why he jumped ship, so to speak. The entire lecture is built around the machlokes between Yosef and his brothers. Are you familiar with this? How many people in the room have heard about this? No? Nobody? What was the machlokes between Yosef and his brothers? Yosef understood, based on the revelation of God to Abraham at the Bris Bein HaBesarim, Ger Yezarocha Be'eretz Lo Lahem, that we are at a very critical turning point in history, in Jewish history, and we've got to prepare for that turning point. We are about to enter into the exile. And the good old ways that we're familiar with from the Avos, from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that's not going to be enough. That's not going to do it for us. Those traditional modes of behavior and the kind of work that we do, we have to prepare for a radical change. If we're not prepared, then the exile in Mitzrayim could, heaven forbid, bring us totally down. And the brothers rejected it. They were not willing to accept the revolutionary ideas of Yosef. They felt, let's leave well enough alone. This is the tradition, and we've been building based on our avos, and we're doing fine. We're living a religious life. We're living in Eretz Canaan. Right now, we're fine. You worried about the exile? We'll face that difficulty when it comes around the bend. At the end of the day, despite the fact that it was Yosef against all his brothers in this controversy, Hashgacha, divine providence, paskin like Yosef. That means that they were on the verge of entering into the exile, into Ervas Haaretz, Eretz Mitzrayim, and they had to be prepared for this. And Rav Soloveitchik said that in a similar way, there was a controversy between Zionism and the traditional Jewish approach based on the Avos, based on thousands of years of tradition. And the Zionist movement said we have to prepare for a whole new existence, to establish a state that will protect the well-being and the welfare of the Jewish people, the refugees. And Rav Soloveitchik said that he was brought up with the traditionalist approach, but what he saw in his lifetime, in the 40s and especially in the 50s, is that Hashgacha, paskin like Yosef, paskin in favor of the establishment of the state. What is our attitude towards non-Jews? If you take a look at a page, I'm hoping that you'll find it. It's called Reflections of the Rav. Yeah, please, Mary. Right. He lived through the period of the Holocaust. Again, he was not in the Holocaust.
And was willing to go against.
Exactly. And he lost sleepless nights. I mean, I can't begin to tell you how much opposition he faced from his own family members.
Why did there continue to be opposition if they see the obvious need for it?
That's a different question. I don't know. For that, we need another hour. But I'm just telling you where Rav Soloveitchik was coming from in his attitude towards Zionism. And in this essay, again, you're only looking at part of it, is Rav Soloveitchik's attitude towards the non-Jewish population. What is the Jewish attitude towards non-Jews in contemporary life? And it's not something that was addressed neither by Rabbi Yisrael nor by Rav Nosson. And he bases himself on a pasuk that Avraham Avinu says, Ger v'toshav anochi machem. On the one hand, I'm a ger, I'm a foreigner, but I'm also a toshav. I'm a member, I'm a citizen. How could it be both at the same time? And in typical style, Rav Soloveitchik has what you call a dialectic. There's a thesis, an antithesis. And he writes, on the one hand, as a citizen, the Jew assumes the social and political obligation to contribute to the general welfare, to combat diseases, famine, corruption, foreign enemies. And yet, on the bottom paragraph on the left side, page 170, the Jew has another identity, which he does not share with the balance of mankind. And that is, we are part of a covenantal community. We are part of a bris with HaKadosh Baruch Hu established at our Sinai over 3,000 years ago. And this gives us a unique identity of a ger. Ger meaning we're separated from the nations. So we're really in this kind of tension, which he talks about here on page 171, an inevitable tension in trying to uphold these two polar ideas that seem to be mutually exclusive. On the one hand, we're gerim, and we have allegiance to our own covenantal community. But on the other hand, we are members of society, and we take the welfare of reality very seriously in order to care about the welfare of the people around us. And then he goes on in the balance of this essay, which we don't have time for tonight, and he speaks about at what point is there such a deviation when the nations of the world around us will be immoral and intolerant, and especially the Jew. At that point, we are no longer gerim. We are no longer part of the community, and we break away. But until that point, we should give thanks to the Ribono Shalom for being in a society that is pluralistic, that's based on freedom and identifies the freedom of every individual. And not only that, he says we should even celebrate, as I mentioned to you last week, Thanksgiving. He was a real patriot, Rav Soloveitchik. And talk about the role of the Jewish woman. Once again, as we said before, a woman is not obligated in the midst of Talmud Torah the way a man is. Again, actually, she has so many obligations in Talmud Torah. In any event, but Rav Soloveitchik put the emphasis even on those areas where clearly a woman is exempt from Talmud Torah. Yet, if on her own initiative she wants to study Torah, she's motivated and moved and inspired, and she takes it seriously, then we should afford the women with all the possibilities that they can have. And what about secular knowledge? Now, here I have to tell you, Rav Soloveitchik was very extreme in favor of secular knowledge. And I hope I won't get flack for saying this publicly, but if you were a family member and you didn't go to Harvard, no good. No good. You had to go to Harvard. It wasn't just enough to go to City College, you know what I'm saying? You had to have the highest level of secular education. And Rav Soloveitchik put a lot of emphasis on the study of mathematics. That was like top on the totem pole because he felt that mathematics would train your mind how to analyze and think. So that when his son-in-law, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zechor Levracha, finally finished his PhD in English literature, so the Rav, and he came to his father-in-law, expecting the Rav to say, wow, you got a PhD from Harvard. And the Rav immediately said to him, now will you study math? But philosophy, as you know, the Rav himself was so steeped in philosophy, one footnote in his halachic man, a lonely man of faith, would take us months to analyze. He knew it all. And when he came to class in the University of Berlin, he studied properly. He was in classes with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He never understood. The Lubavitcher Rebbe came in with piles and piles of Sfarim. And yet he got A's on all his exams. He says, for me, he said about himself, Rav Soloveitchik, I had to listen to every word that came out of the professor's mouth. I couldn't be steeped in learning and get an A on the exam. In any event, he wrote his PhD thesis on Herman Cohen. There's a rumor, I don't know if it's ever been substantiated, that he wanted to write his thesis on Plato and try to show that there's a relationship between the Rambam and Plato in that theory. In any event, all of this secular knowledge became very important. The Gaon, the Vilna Gaon, is assumed, I don't know if it's ever been proven, to have said that if you're missing secular knowledge in the 7 branches of Chachma, of wisdom, then you're missing in your Torah knowledge. You must have that wisdom in order to understand and analyze Torah on the deepest level. Unbelievable integration of both Torah knowledge and lahavdil secular knowledge, all integrated into one. But I have to tell you what the critics say about Rav Soloveitchik in a number of these points. They claim that Rav Soloveitchik is describing an ideal, a very lofty, high level that very, very few people could achieve. And this created a whole raucous about co-education, boys and girls studying together in class. And in the high school that Rav Soloveitchik and more his wife, his Rebbetzin, created the Maimonides school in Boston, the men and the women would learn Gemara together in class. And the critics said, no, Rav Soloveitchik was not in favor of this, but there weren't enough funds to create 2 schools and have classes that were separated. This is a machlokus that's going to go on and on until Mashiach comes. What I'd like to discuss with you now, and I may be jumping a little bit ahead of myself, but I have so much to say to you tonight, is that I believe that although we have these 3 legs, the Shlosha Amudim, Sha'olam Omed Aleim, and they integrate because there's so much in common. And the differences seem secondary. It's all a question of where you put the emphasis. So Rav Soloveitchik would put the emphasis on Havanas HaTorah, and Rab Nosson of Breslov would put the emphasis on Pnimius HaTorah, and Rabbi Yisrael Salanter on Midos HaTorah. But I think it's not just an issue of priorities and where to put the emphasis. And in the last couple of weeks, as this series has developed, I have organized for myself a list of approximately 7 different major issues of contention here in our tripod, as we call it. Number 1, the relationship between Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba, this world and the next. From the perspective of Rav Soloveitchik, and I would assume Rabbi Yisrael SALANTER as well, all of our emphasis, all our eggs are in one basket. Which world? This world. Olam Hazeh. Forget about Olam Haba. That's not your issue. As the Mishnah tells us in Avos, don't be an Eved HaMeshamish is Rabbi Manasakav. Don't think about Olam Haba. Yafa sha'achas b'Olam Hazeh mikol chai Olam Haba. 1 hour. The Vilna Gaon, at the end of his life, was holding on to his tzitzis. And he was yelling and declaring, in this world, in one moment, I could be Makayim the mitzvah of tzitzis, which is shakol keneged taryag mitzvahs. And all this is going to be over. All this is going to be gone. Someone who passes away is called Potter min ha-mitzvahs. All of our emphasis is on embracing this world and bringing the divine being down into this world and thereby elevating this world. But when you read the works of Rabbi Nassan, you get an entirely different perspective. This world is nothing more than a prose door. It's an antechamber. It's only a means to an end. And the real true existence that we prepare ourselves for in this existence is Olam Haba, all our emphasis and all our beliefs and all our prayers. The first thing you should say when you wake up in the morning, you don't have to say it, you think it, is there's a world to come, a world of infinity, of eternity. That should be the first thought when I wake up and I open my eyes in the morning, even before I recite Modani. Because the entire focus of my life is all for the world to come, the world of Ein Sof, of infinity. And this, I believe, generated a second point of contention, the attitude towards death. In the writings of Rav Soloveitchik, death is the absolute curse, the enemy of man. There's no greater curse than death. Death is tumah. Death is contamination. A corpse contaminates. A Kohen is not allowed to go in or have any connection to a mess. We are not allowed to contaminate ourselves. And Rav Soloveitchik, an halachic man, pointed out that his grandfather Reb Chaim would not visit cemeteries unless he absolutely had to in order to bury the dead. And then you open up the works of Rabbi Nassan, and what a world of a difference. The essence of man is a combination of guf and neshama. The physical body of man together with the spirit of man. That neshama comes from a very high place. Its origin is in the Almighty. But it was brought down to this earth. And it's constantly desiring to separate itself from this earth. The guf, the body, incarcerates the neshama. It brings it down. Death is a blessing. The passage from life to death is not something that should frighten us. Obviously, we want to live as long as we can, ad meir v'yesrim, in order to achieve whatever we could possibly achieve in the will of God, but not to be afraid of death, not to contaminate death, but rather to realize. He quotes a Medrash, Rabbi Meir says, Tov ma'od zamisa. Could you imagine saying about death, Tov ma'od? A whole nother perspective. Another area of contention, limud ha-musser, the study of musser. I have here amongst the pages that I photocopied for you, a page that looks like this. It says Likutei Halachos. And if you look on the left column, this is in Hilchos Shabbos, Rabbi Nassan writes, Zeu gam kein hachiluk bein alomed sifrei musser levad lebein hamiskarvim l'tzadik ha'emes. He says, Afal Pishal Limud Sifrei Musser, this study of Musser books, is Yakar Miod Ma'od. Aval afal pichen ein mivoarim sham kol kach eitzos tovos lavodaso. This is a tremendous Parshas Drachim, a parting of ways between Rabbi Yisrael SALANTER on the one hand and Rabbi Nosson of Breslov on the other. Whereas Rabbi Yisrael and his Talmidim, till this very day, we mentioned Dali Shor before, are advocates of introducing into the study, the daily discipline of Torah study, reading the books of musser. Rabbi Nosson has a different priority, which he calls Eitzah. Eitzah means good counsel. What the generation needs, and every generation is bestowed with its tzaddik, is that the tzaddik will teach us eitzos, how to live our lives. All of the works of Rabbi Nosson are all about how to live our life. I mentioned earlier, we're on our way up, and we reach a high, and then we start falling down, and then we pick ourselves up again. And we have to have eitzos. We have to have counsel and wisdom and recommendations as to how to face all these challenges and not to let them get us down, because, as we said before, the adversity and the evil is all in atzvus. And simcha is the answer to everything. Again, my friends, don't think that when I say simcha, I mean you have to jump on top of trucks. I don't know about that. If you want to do that, that's fine. It's your thing, if that's your thing. That's not what we're talking about. Simcha is an inner state of being. It's a constant awareness of the great chesed that God bestowed upon us. When we recite modim every morning 3 times a day in tefillah, al nisecha v'neflosecha, you know what nisim and neflos Rabbi Nosson says we have in mind? The fact that God doesn't reject us despite the pagamim. And no matter how low a person reaches, God is still there. And God beckons to that person and listens to every move that might possibly inspire that person. So it's all about eitzos. And we could read the Sifrei Musar, and it might have an impact on us, and it might inspire us, but it won't give us eitzos. And that's what this whole Torah is all about. Rav Soloveitchik himself is also opposed, initially at least, to the study of musser. He felt that when Rabbi Yisrael introduced musser, it was a movement that brought to melancholy. You remember the mashal that Reb Chaim gave, that if you feed castor oil to someone who's healthy, he's going to surely get sick. We're healthy. We don't need musser. But in one of the paragraphs, which I gave you to read here in the photocopied pages, again, I should have kept one for myself, but anyway, hopefully you'll find it. Oh yeah, it should have a circle and a 9 on top. If you find such a page on the right side, Ish Halacha. Do you see it, the right side on the second half of the page? L'manat tzedek v'emes yesh ladgish ki tnuat hamusar hevia simanei gadlut u'bagrut b'shvat knesses Yisrael. This is what we call slabodka. Have you heard of slabodka? No, the name of the work is called Ish Halacha, halachic man. Own pen. Well, no. This is an essay of 150 pages, out of which I'm cutting out 5 lines out of an essay that covers a wealth of information. But in 5 lines, he addresses the objection of Reb Chaim to musser, as I said before, because musser brought a state of melancholy. They used to close the lights Shalashudis time and berate themselves and so forth and so on. I'm not going to go into detail, but here, Rav Soloveitchik is saying that if we want an honest to goodness contemporary attitude towards musser, things have changed. Musser has taken on a whole different shape. Under the influence of Rav Nata Finkel, right, the Altar of Slabodka, Ubishivas Mir, under the influence of Rabbi Yerucham Lubavitz. I mean, to read their works would be an amazing achievement on our part. And if we would combine that with reading the great musser works of Rav Shlomo Volpa, he has works, Vadim, V'chasanim, and Kalos, I mean, real practical stuff in a contemporary life in Ali Shor. And you'll see the English translation on the left side if you're interested. And then a piece from the Altar of Slabodka about the greatness of man. No matter what we do for him, it's never, never enough. So here we have a little bit of a bone of contention about the study of musser, whether it should be introduced as part of the curriculum. And now I get to another issue, and I've been working on this. I can't get my head off it. And that's tefillah. You may have photocopies of Shiurim L'Zecha B'Mori. Again, I'm so apologetic here because I'm not organized, and I put out all these pages on the table without leaving myself any pages. But hopefully you'll find a page that either says Shiurim L'Zecha B'Mori on top, or... Oh, thank you so much. Here, it should say Mem Aleph on the bottom. There may be another sequel to this. I don't know if it made it here or didn't make it here. David, does it say Shiurim L'Zecha B'Mori on top? Oh, Binyan Smichut Gula Tefillah. That's one essay in a book called Shiurim L'Zecha. These are the Yartzeit Shiurim from Gimel Shvat. And the Rav develops a Sugya in Masechta Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara quotes a three-way machlokas about when a person is allowed to ask what's called bakashas tzrachav, right? I have my own personal needs, and I want to supplicate God, and I want to somehow pray on my own behalf for those particular unique individual needs. And there are three shittas about how to do this. According to one Tana, you have to do it before Shmona Esrei. According to another Tana, you do it after Shmona Esrei. And according to third Tana, you inject it into Shema Kolenu in the middle of Shmona Esrei. And the Rav is wondering, it's a Sugya in Avodah Zarah Daf Zayin. Nobody says anything about this Gemara. Somehow it got lost in the shuffle. What's it all about? Well, what they're racking their brains, Tanoim, about where to inject my own supplications? And the Rav said, because who is man? Mortal man, physical, made of flesh and blood. Yelud Isha, he's here today and God tomorrow. And he's going to stand in front of the Melech Malchei Amlochim, the King of Kings, with his own personal supplications? Who are you? Mi Samcha. What license do you have? And according to one Tana, if you attach it to Shmona Esrei, which is established as a formal standard prayer by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, then it gets swept in. It's almost as if the King of Kings has opened the door, a crack, when you're ready for Shmona Esrei, because Anshe Knesset Gedolah established Shmona Esrei. Now you can inject your own personal supplications. The second man, the Yomer says, no, you have to do it within the framework of Shmona Esrei. You have to inject it in that bracha where it's appropriate, or in the Patpori, the general bracha, the fallback bracha, which is called Shema Kolenu. And the third shita says, no, you can't touch the framework of Shmona Esrei the way it was formulated by Chazal. You're allowed to add your supplication at the end of Shmona Esrei. And the Gemara tells us in Brachos how each Amora used to add his own tefillah. We have Elokai Nitzor. I don't know how to reconcile this with Rab Nosson. In the philosophy of Rab Nosson, it's on every other page, there's something called his bodidus. There have been children's books written about his bodidus. His bodidus means, can you talk to God? Can you pour your heart out to God? So you tell a Litvak about his bodidus, the first thing he says to you is, I don't know what to say to God. That's the problem. What's your relationship like with God if you don't know what to say to him? Where is your friendship with God? Where is your dependence on God, your closeness? All of Avodah is about getting close to the Ribono Shel Olam. You can't say words to the Ribono Shel Olam. You can't find the words. So again, whether it means that you have to go out to the fields, but find a private moment. And I don't know if you could commensurate with my pain, because I don't know how to reconcile these two mutually exclusive approaches to tefillah. According to Rav Soloveitchik, it's all about the formal tefillah that was standardized and formulated by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. And from the perspective of Rabbi Nosson, whose yahrzeit, as I said before, was today, the emphasis here is on your personal supplications, your personal prayers. Shake the heavens. Of course, you have to read the standard prayers. We are absolutely committed to the Shulchan Aruch, the Likutei Halachos is a work on Shulchan Aruch from cover to cover. But where's the emphasis? Where's the ultimate prayer? The ultimate prayer is your prayer when you communicate with God. And I came up with the following thesis. You'll be my jury. I've never said this to anyone. The Gemara tells us that Chasidim Harishonim, we're not talking about, after the Besh. Chasidim Rishonim, the Gemara tells us, Hayushoim Shah Achas Kodem Atfilah. They would wait and prepare themselves for a full hour before Tfilah. Chasidim Rishonim in the Gemara's time. And after Tfilah, another hour. And they daven for an hour. How many hours is that? Yeah, but multiply it by 3. How many is that? 9 hours. And the Gemara asks, so what? How did they have time for Torah learning? They spent 9 hours a day on Tefillah. And the Gemara says, Torasa misbareches, that there was like a special miracle from heaven that the Torah was blessed. According to Rav Soloveitchik, based on the Gemara in Avodah, and I encourage all of you to read through this, we don't have time now, you're not allowed to daven except for the framework of Shmones or attach it. What's the Shah Achas? And I'd like to suggest the following answer. Rav Soloveitchik is talking about something called Bakoshas Tzrachav. When we ask God for our personal needs. But tefillah, prayer, is much broader than that. Hisbodedus in Breslov, again, I could be dead wrong about this, but my impression is it's not about Bakoshas Tzrachav. It's not about, Nebuch, my mother is not feeling so well and I want to pray on her behalf. That's Bakoshas Tzrachav. Tefillah is much broader than that. When I stand in front of the Ribono Shalom in Hisbodedus and I pour out my heart, I'm saying to God, these are my difficulties. These are my pagamim. These are my blemishes. These are my faults. This is where I fell. God, please help me. Give me the guidance. Show me the path, how I can rise, how I can ascend, how I can get closer and closer to you. Those are the essence, the essential points of Hisbodedus.
So it's a personal request, but not necessarily like how send me finances,
Right, we're asking for help in his karvus, his chazkus, to get closer to you. It's a way of saying to a father, Dad, we've had some, which I say, I don't want to use the word altercations, but we've had some misunderstandings. Usually, we say these words when it's too late. But with our relationship to God, it's never too late. And the Almighty is always there for us. But it's got to be sincere, and it's training. It's not something that the Israelis talk about zbang. It's not zbang. It's not, you don't just, snap your fingers and you go into Hisbodedus. This is something that you build up as your relationship with the Almighty intensifies and deepens because you have more challenges. More challenges, please.
Doesn't it become routine if it's integrated into one's day in a way that it affects them as a next step?
So that's also something that you have to pour your heart out and ask God to help you, that there should always be a hischadshus. Hischadshus means it should always be new. Every day, according to Rabbi Nassan, is an entity that is infinite in time. Every day generates its own obligations. And we wake up in the morning and we accept upon ourselves the obligations of this day. Forget about yesterday. Don't live in the past. Live in the now, in the present. What can I set up as my goal, my schedules, my agenda for this day? What can I achieve? How can I get closer to God? How can I purify myself? How can I remove my pagamim, my blemishes? How can I uplift myself? How can I study God's Torah? One of the greatest supplications that a person should have in his Hisbodedus is, God, I don't understand your Torah. I've been studying Likutei Halachos, and I don't understand. Help me understand. Show me the way. Really, show me the light. What should I be doing with myself? How can I achieve these goals? No. Tzrachav means when I have something that is in my world, my physical, material world that I'm asking for. You know what I mean? It's parnasa. So parnasa, by the way, la'aloch l'maisa, if you have a bakosha for parnasa, you can inject it, and you should inject it into the 9th bracha, which is called Berchas Hashanim. And that's where we ask for rain. So if I'm having trouble with my parnasa, that's where I'm going to inject that tefillah. But finally, and here I think is, again, one of these almost irreconcilable points of contention. I realize it's getting late, so I'm going to try to finish up. I wanted to talk about the unique contribution of Rav Nosson, but more or less you got the point. Subjective emotionalism. Rav Soloveitchik goes on a tirade. It's almost like enemy number one, and it appears in so many of his essays, his writings, his drushos. Anti-subjective emotionalism. Everything is in the mind, in the intellect. We don't run around with emotions. That comes from other sources that are totally foreign to us. And people like Korach and his rebellion, again, now's not the time to go into it, they tried to put the emphasis on the emotions. What do I feel? I put on my tzitzis and I feel, wow, I'm uplifted. You know what I mean? That's where it's all at. Not from the perspective of Soloveitchik. That's subjectivism. All of halacha, ish halacha, is about objectifying. That's why ish halacha, halachic man, is like the mathematician, where everything is objective. And the system of halacha is a brilliantly logical system, self-contained. And yet, in the works of all Hasidism, and especially in the works of Rabbi Nosson, so much emphasis on the leiv, on the feelings, on the emotions, on being uplifted, on being inspired, on simcha, on joy, on feelings of being strengthened, uplifted, of facing my challenges and discovering Almighty God and His hand as He guides me. I mean, it's all about emotionalism and how to reconcile this. And the thought occurred to me, and with this, I'll try to wrap it up because I know the hour is late. And I would like to take some questions if possible, if anyone has. There's no question in my mind that these are two worldviews. And to a large extent, in this particular context, to our surprise, Rabbi Yisrael SALANTER, I think, is closer to Rabbi Nosson. And that may shock you, but that's my opinion. Because if you remember, again, this about 6 weeks ago, I don't know when we started. It's been a while, so I don't expect you to remember. But we spoke about the fact that in Rabbi Yisrael's learning of musser, it was all about working up a frenzy. It was all about hispalus, lehitpa'el. Hispalus means when I feel lifted and swept away, I over and over again repeat that which is hard for me, that which I'm challenged in terms of my midos perfection and my self-perfection. All that is foreign to Rav Soloveitchik, and that's why Reb Chaim was initially opposed to the musser approach. Too much emphasis on subjective emotionalism. This running around and screaming. You remember we told the story about one fellow who realized that he owed Meiser Ksuf. He started screaming at himself. That's Rabbi Yisrael's approach. However, what I do believe is that the machlokas here, the contention, is not as wide as we think it is. Even Rav Soloveitchik, over and over again in his writings, emphasizes the emotional element. In fact, More than once, I personally heard from him with almost tears in his eyes that he was he was crying over the fact that he has not succeeded in transmitting to his students the emotional experience of a Rosh Hashanah, of a shofar blowing, of a Yom Kippur, of imagining the Kohen Gadol going lifnai v'lifnim. I was unable, he cried, to transmit this to my students. The difference is that from a SOLOVEITCHIK perspective, the emotionalism has to come at the end of the road. It has to come second in sequence. It's a result of my intellectual understanding of the depths of Torah. If I can appreciate what the Avodah, the Kohen Gadol is, if I can learn through Masechta Yoma, all the nuances of laws, they're endless, about that one day of the year when the Kohen Gadol goes lifnai v'lifnim and all the Avodah he does outside. And then I sing Mara Kohen. That emotional frenzy of Mara Kohen is very much appropriate. That's the Kiyum Shebalev that Rav Soloveitchik always speaks about. But it has to begin with an objective Maisa Mitzvah. I start with an action which can be objectified. I take a lulav, I sit in the sukkah, I eat the matzah, I blow the shofar, and then I trigger off an emotional response that is a result of the Maisa, a result of the action. There's no emotionalism in a subjective sense, helter-skelter. So I conclude with the following idea, that we have a tremendous opportunity to learn the Torah, the ethical teachings of these three giants, and to see how close they are one to the other. And Aaron pointed out very beautifully to me, Avilome Mikol Adam, that we can really learn from all. Each one in his own unique way contributes. Rav Soloveitchik will give us more of the contemporary, and Rav Yisrael will give us more of the self-analysis and Midos perfection program. And Rav Nosson will give us the entire gamut of how to serve Hashem and feel close to Hashem and constantly be focused on God and getting close to God. And if we integrate all these three elements, we can create what I think is a beautiful, beautiful society, a community that would be l'shem u'tiferes b'Yisrael. Ken Yiratzon. Amen. Thank you very much.